Today we are going to talk about how Vice is going bankrupt, where it came from and why it's shutting down. For those who are unaware, Vice is a media organization that does news and other documentaries. Vice announced their plans for bankruptcy before news came in that they would be purchased by a vulture fund called Fortress Management for $400 million. Vice has been laying off many reporters across the world. Their nightly show, Vice News Tonight, that used to air on HBO, was shut down completely. Vice is a media organization. They run an online news website that's pretty popular within certain niches. Most know Vice as that large YouTube channel that releases edgy documentaries for free. The organization started out in Montreal as a small magazine. They relied on a gonzo style of journalism, utilizing reports on personal experiences and emotions compared to the usual detached style of most traditional journalism. While they grew, Vice did content about drug cartels and risqué topics that traditional media orgs tried their best not to cover. The virality of their content, both on and off YouTube, helped them carve out a profitable niche readership for themselves. People liked the brash, in-your-face style of Vice's content. Large investors caught wind of Vice's operations. Firms like 21st Century Fox and other larger private firms poured money to Vice, betting on its future growth. Some founders of media organizations saw Vice as a gold standard for journalism and respected them.
Let's talk about the Vice bankruptcies. There was a Wall Street Journal article that Vice is going bankrupt, womp womp. Small side note, when I joined Barstool, Vice was like the gold standard. Like, I studied Vice upstairs, downstairs, sideways, like every which way possible, because I felt like it was a brand that grew out of Montreal. It had a cult following. It was the voice of a youth generation. It stood for something. They had a crazy founder. Like, there was all sorts of, not parallels, but there were all sorts of similarities. I really looked at Vice. I remember, when Disney was going to buy Vice, and it had this crazy valuation, and it was so big that I remember thinking, like, God, could Barstool ever be that big? Like, could we ever be in the same stratosphere as Vice? So it's kind of surreal, like the same year that we got acquired, that Vice is now filing for bankruptcy, and I think there's a lot to unpack in it.
However, Vice would eventually announce that they would be going bankrupt. Vice is going to sell their operations to a few of their investors, Fortress Investment Group and the Soros Fund, for $400 million. That amount seems high, but considering they used to be worth $5.7 billion, Vice's valuation has dropped by over tenfold. It was laughable that Vice actually tried to ask for $1.5 billion in the sale. They aren't worth that much anymore. The buyout will mean its other investors like James Murdoch will lose all their money which they invested in Vice. With its ownership changing, it won't be long before a major shakeup happens within the company. The firm buying Vice is Fortress Management, which is what's known as a vulture fund. Vulture funds tend to be aggressive. Fortress does high risk, high reward plays. They buy up problematic companies at stupidly low prices so they can turn them around to keep operating costs low for their portfolio of companies. Vulture funds like Fortress will often do layoffs of staff to make sure the company doesn't lose too much of their money. They need to make money somehow. So how did Vice get here? This is not the best position to be in. Vice has been bleeding money for ages. Disney wrote off their $400 million investment in Vice as early as 2019, an entire 4 years before Vice announced their bankruptcy. Vice has had to go through a continuous cycle of layoffs and emergency fundraising for years. The thing about using edgy content for clicks is that advertisers get cold feet. There's a reason why traditional media orgs try to stay boring and detached, so advertisers can buy ads on their platform. Vice had problems finding advertisers willing to put their ads on Vice's content. They were deemed as a brand risk. It got so bad they were actively struggling to find a buyer for almost a year. Complications arose for Vice when Antenna Group terminated their contract to distribute over 250 hours of Vice videos across Europe. A contract that was supposed to end in 2024 was terminated a year earlier. Investors trying to buy up Vice Media saw it as a bad sign and withdrew their bids. We live in an era where new age media companies are having a tough time surviving. BuzzFeed's news division shut down earlier in the year. Other media organizations like Vox that produces content that are more sterile for investors and that advertisers had layoffs to preserve capital. Currently, Vice's best case scenario is to sell itself to Fortress Group. This buyout is not set in stone just yet. If a buyer actually appears offering to buy Vice for more than $400 million, then its new owners might change. A company spokesperson for Vice confirmed this by saying Vice was evaluating all their strategic alternatives and planning. Their board of directors and investors were still working out what was best for the company. This was an emailed statement to Reuters. Vice is still hoping that another buyer might swoop in at the last minute to save it. To survive, Vice is trying to speed up its entry into the streaming platforms like Paramount and other platforms like TikTok, where they already have a few million followers across their various accounts. Vice has come a long way from its time as a tiny punk magazine operating out of Montreal. The company isn't really going away. It will stay. Fortress management will make sure of that. As for the values Vice once stood for, whatever it was, they might not get to keep it. Vice News is still sending out articles. Their film division is still continuing to pump out documentaries. However, the quality of those newer Vice content might be worse with all the cost-cutting Fortress management plans to impose on their new acquisition. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, smash the subscribe button so you can watch more of my videos.